Changing your food choices can often feel like a daunting task, where it's like, do I have to completely alter how I'm eating and what I'm eating in order to improve my health and reach my fitness goals? While many nutritional dogmas out there would lead you to believe that it's either their way or the highway, the fact of the matter is there's another option out there that does not feel restrictive in nature, but will still allow you to reach your health and fitness goals. This is exactly what we're discussing on today's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast with nutritional expert Mike Millner. We're going to cue the intro song and then we're going to dive right into this conversation. Welcome to the Exercise is Health podcast, where we're talking about exercise, health, and the interconnectedness of the two. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we will be coming to you every single week from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg. Hey, what's going on, exercisers? This is Charlie. Before we dive into this week's episode, I want to let you know about a new training that's happening this week titled How to Rebuild Your Aching Body in as little as 6 weeks without changing your lifestyle. See, if you love the discussions that we have every single week on the Exercise is Health podcast, but you want more of the practical application, the details of how to take the information and apply it to your workouts, then you need to be on this training. All you have to do to get registered for free is go to secrets.exerciseforlifemethod.com. But space is limited, so make sure to get registered ASAP. Now, without further ado, let's dive into this week's episode. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health podcast. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we're coming to you from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg, here in Schaumburg, Illinois, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset. And the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. And we want to take a second right now and say thank you to every single one of you exercisers who's taken the time to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We truly appreciate it because it helps us spread our message. It helps this content reach more people. And because of that, we want to take a moment right now to read a rating and review that we recently received.
This 5-star review says, "Wow, I'm so happy I found this podcast. Julie and Charlie have great tips and examples where I find myself really relating. They are well thought out and deliver relative and helpful content. Thank you for your commitment to us, your podcast community. We like to call you guys our exercisers because you are exercising for life and exercising for your health." Thank you so much for that 5-star review. We thrive off of reviews. So if you have been enjoying this content, we would love to hear from you. It would take less than a minute of your time. All you do is go on your podcasting app, scroll to the bottom, and leave us a rating and review.
Now, our expertise here at Muscle Activation Schaumburg is exercise and helping people exercise to build the health and function of their body in a sustainable way that they can keep coming back to day after day, decade after decade. But we understand that when it comes to your health, exercise is only a piece of the puzzle. It's not the only piece of the puzzle. And so we bring on rock star guests to help you understand the other pieces that you need to consider in order to build the health and function of your body. Rock stars like our guest today, Mike Millner. Now, Mike Millner has been a high-level nutrition coach for almost 10 years, and he has a gift for understanding the psychological and physiological needs of his clients, which has led to thousands of success stories. His personality-based approach with an emphasis on mindset has set a new standard in the industry for which other coaches can learn and implement through the neurotyping certification. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Oh, right on, man. Yeah, likewise. So talk to me. All right, I know that you focus a lot with nutrition, you focus a lot with training, but like diet's a big thing with you. So how do you define diet?
Yeah, I think it's a funny word. It's almost become like a buzzword now. And I think oftentimes we associate the word diet with restriction. Which, it's like I'm on a diet. By definition, typically that individual is referring to something that is restrictive by nature. They're cutting out certain foods. They're following a plan. They're doing something, a name diet, whether it be keto or paleo or vegan, whatever the eating style may be. Whereas diet by definition is simply the foods that we consume, the drinks that we drink. Like it's not inherently a negative word. We've definitely placed a negative connotation on it. And I think rightfully so, because if you look at traditional diets, how they're established now, there's a lot of research that would suggest they're highly ineffective. So a lot of people, think of the word diet in terms of restriction. When I hear the word diet, I think of what are the nutritional principles? What are the foods that this individual is eating from a non-judgmental standpoint? Like, let's just look at what are you consuming on a daily basis? And that's how I prefer to use the word diet. But I realize that in our society right now, it's typically like something that you're either on or off, which can be a net negative.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? It's such a great point because, I mean, all of us, whether we are, quote unquote, on a diet or not, like there are certain foods that we eat and there are certain foods that we don't eat, whether by choice or by strategy or whatever. But you're absolutely right. For some reason, when it comes to diet, now all of a sudden it's like, well, there are these very rigid guidelines that I have to follow. And by following these guidelines, I'm going to get, X kind of result. But like, do you really see that being the case that, you follow this really rigid path and people get the results that you want? Or what's been your experience with people following these, these more restrictive diets?
Yeah, I mean, there's a large body of evidence that diets don't work in that way. When you follow a set of rigid rules, while some people like to have structure, there's a big difference between having a framework of, let's say, nutritional principles. For example, I personally like to eat 80%, quality whole foods, minimally processed, that sort of thing. That can be a nutritional principle versus I can't eat carbs. Like that is, if I'm on a diet and my diet tells me I'm not allowed to eat carbs, we know definitively from research that can lead to a lot of weight regain because you're relying on discipline and willpower. There's typically a start date and an end date associated with that diet. And if we're trying to be healthy and fit for life, it doesn't make sense to operate within those confines. So no, the answer is diets set up that way. We have a lot of evidence to suggest they don't work. And from anecdotal evidence, I can back that up as well.
I mean, I just love so much of what you said, that concept of like trying to be healthy and fit for life. That's something that we preach all the time on this podcast, all the time in our social content. And I know that your thoughts are right along those lines as well. It's like, all right, what can we do? Not just today, not just tomorrow, but really like for the rest of forever to set us up to be healthy, to have, abundant health and be able to do the things in life that we want to do. So with that in mind, like when people are trying to, plan their nutrition and think about things for the long term, what are some of the challenges or the mistakes that you see people making?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest mistakes is kind of along the lines of what we're talking about. Most people begin the process with eliminating first. And psychologically, that puts you in a state of almost like you're a ticking time bomb. Because let's just say you have a habit of drinking a lot of soda and you want to cut back. Most people would logically say, okay, well, I'm drinking a lot of soda and maybe that's not the best decision for me. So I'm going to try to eliminate soda, and they might join a challenge, or they might sign up for a program or go on a diet, right, that tells them, well, you're not allowed to, have soda. Okay, so they go cold turkey and they cut everything out. Now all of a sudden you're in this restrictive mindset, telling yourself that you can't have that thing. Whereas if you know that it's available to you whenever you want it and you're making a conscious choice, it's a big difference. What I prefer is let's add first before we subtract.
Okay.
The analogy that I always use is the best way to get soap out of a bottle is not to just dump the soap out, because then you're sitting there, you're shaking it. The last bit of soap always stays in the bottle.
Sure.
More effective strategy is to fill the bottle with water. And eventually when you fill it with water, the soap is going to come out. At first it'll be a little bit of water, a little bit of soap, and then ultimately it will be all water. Yes. So for that same individual, what if we said, don't change anything with the amount of soda you're drinking, but let's just start drinking more water. Let's add. Why don't we start eating more quality foods? Like, let's look at addition first. And then there might be a time. And typically what we see is when you start to participate in more health promoting behaviors, you start to make those conscious choices on your own versus my diet's telling me I can't have these things. Yeah. Versus, you know what? I don't really feel like having a second soda today. So now I'm down to one. And then, of course, at some point in time, there's a level of restraint that's needed. But I like to keep the willpower battery nice and charged for when we really need it.
Yeah, I love so much about that. I mean, just the idea of like, okay, well, first, let's start by adding in positive. Just think about like the mindset difference with that versus somebody saying, well, I'm going to start by removing the things that I kind of like.
Like just off the bat, that's already a huge difference. So I would have to imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would have to imagine that the long-term success rate, meaning let's say success is like actually sticking with it, it ends up being much higher for this approach. Is that what you've found with people?
Yeah, it's just, the name of the game is finding the way of doing things. Like I'll go back to the principles, finding those like health promoting principles that serve you, and everybody's unique. Everybody's an individual. So unfortunately, there's not like we always try to find like what's the best diet. It doesn't exist. It's everybody is so different. So it's about finding the right path for each person. And when it comes to being consistent and being able to sustain those results, yeah, the more that we can add first and get somebody to really enjoy the process, the more likely they are to sustain their results. And it works for nutrition as well. It's not just, I use the example of cutting back on soda, but let's say you're trying to cut back on processed foods, or you find yourself stopping at, a fast food, drive-through too frequently. Well, what if we just start to add more quality veggies, fruits, protein, high quality foods? And it's like, let's add that first.
Yeah.
Don't change anything that you're doing. Just add in these, more quality food choices, and let's see how that makes you feel. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, I have more energy. My thoughts are a little bit more clear, and I feel better overall. Maybe I'm going to skip the drive-through today. And it comes down to conscious choice, and it really puts the individual in a place of empowerment versus feeling restricted and deprived.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I know one thing that you specialize in, or I should say a term that you've coined that is really very new to me, is this idea of personality-based nutrition. So like, what is personality-based nutrition? Like, what do you mean by that? And how does that get implemented with people?
Yeah. So, it's funny because as humans, we like to name things. We like for things to have labels. And I'm a nerd, a psychology nerd. So I love to study research. It's just a fascinating topic for me. I always tried to answer the question of like, why do humans behave the way that they do? And why do we operate the way that we operate? And part of the reason why we like to label things is because our brain craves certainty. Because as we evolved, anything that was uncertain or unpredictable was a threat to our survival. So we have this like survival system that's coded into our DNA. And if something is like uncertain or unsure, unpredictable, it's a threat. And if we don't know it, it's a threat. So we label things because it gives us that sense of certainty, where if I know what you do for a living, there's a certain thought process that happens. I'm like, oh, this person's a salesman. And we automatically assume, certain things about them, and it creates a level of certainty, which is also why people gravitate towards diets that have a name, because it kind of gives them a little bit of certainty. Now, if I said to, if I'm trying to help people become healthy and fit and achieve all of the success that they want, and I say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start really slow. We're going to build up quality habits over time. We're going to find what works best for you, because you're a unique individual, and we can't just place you into a diet box, because we need to find out what your body responds to, and your personal preferences, and your lifestyle, and your social life, and your work life, and the stress in your life, and how active you are. Right? If I say all these things, now I've lost that person.
Sure.
I coined the term personality diet or personality-based nutrition to basically put a package or a wrapper on this concept of individualization. The fact that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach, that what works for somebody else is probably not going to work for you. So let's actually look at, your personality. Let's look at all the things that make you unique, and let's find the best path forward from there. So it's kind of catering to the psychological need to kind of have a label, without me wanting to like have to ramble like I did to try to explain what we actually do. So it's kind of a cool way to package it.
No, it's a great way. I mean, I think just say, if you think of like a car, if you were trying to describe a car by all of its component parts, nobody would ever want one. But if you just say, well, it's a car, it's like, oh, immediately I know what it is, right? So you're right. There's such value in just having that simple term that, like you're saying, just kind of packages everything, and like, all right, this is what we're calling it. And now people can attach their mind to that. So talk to me, what kind of things do you consider when you are working with somebody, as far as figuring out like, all right, what things should we be adding in with you in order to kind of create this personality-based nutrition?
Yeah, so I love the question. It's, like if you were trying to get anywhere, if you had a destination that you were trying to reach, you need to know where you're starting. And I think that that's oftentimes what people miss. It's like if I'm standing outside in the middle of Philadelphia, I'm from the East Coast. So if I'm in Philadelphia and I put in my GPS and I want to go to a restaurant, and my Google Maps pulls up directions, but it's not from my starting point. Well, those directions are pretty useless. Right?
Yes.
So it doesn't help me very much. So we need to know where we're starting. We also need to know the end point. If I'm trying to, let's say, drive across the country, but I don't know where I'm going, and I just start driving aimlessly, that's going to be a pretty inefficient path to where I want to go. So we need to know where we're starting, and we need to know where we're going. And again, this is where personal preference is so important, because everybody's goals are going to be different. For some people, they really want to be like lean and they want to look the part, and they want, the physique goals, the aesthetic goals. For some people, that's not super important to them. Typically, and this is something I got from NCI, the Nutritional Coaching Institute, and Jason Phillips. He has a phrase called the triangle of awareness, which is like, we typically have goals that are related to either health and longevity, which is one, corner of the triangle. We have performance, which is another corner of the triangle. And we have, aesthetics, which is, so those are your 3 points of the triangle. And for the most part, the more that you go into one extreme, the more you're pulling away from the other two. In other words, if I'm trying to be the absolute best performer, let's say I want to be an NFL athlete, and I'm trying, that's all I care about, I'm probably not going to live really long. Like there's a lot of, there's a cost at putting your body through what they put their bodies through. And I probably don't care about how shredded I am. I'm trying to perform at the highest level. So the more extreme you push, the more you take away from the other two. Now, of course, you can land anywhere within that triangle. So somebody could be right dead in the middle and say, I want equal parts. I want to live and be healthy. I want to perform well. And I also want to look pretty good. But again, like if you think about the extreme of body composition, bodybuilders, bikini competitors, when you're at that level of body fat, it's not healthy. We can't, let's not sugarcoat it. Being 5% body fat is not healthy.
Right.
And you're probably not going to perform really well, because when you're eating that little, it's tough to have energy to perform. So again, it's just, what's your goal? What's the end game? So we have to know, like, where are we starting? Where do we want to be? And now we can start to uncover the most efficient path to get there. Again, it looks different for each person. It really, we want to assess, like, what are the current habits? What's the biggest holdup? Sometimes with individuals, it's like, well, I'm really solid with my nutrition 5 days out of the week, but then the weekends I just go completely off the rails. It's like, great. Well, it doesn't make sense to get into some like advanced protocol. We just need to figure out what's happening on the weekends and how can we create a more balanced approach. Now, it may be that they're being super rigid during the week, which is creating the imbalance on the weekends. It could be that they're eliminating certain things during the week. There's a lot of reasons that could happen, but we got to solve that first before we start getting into any sort of advanced stuff. And some people, their biggest issue might be travel, or it might be their work schedule. Let's look at the low hanging fruit where we know if we solve that, we're going to be just fine. I think the mindset shift is most people try to always beat their best. When it comes to dieting, right? It's like, I need to be perfect. I need to move my body. I need to train 5 days a week. I need to eat perfectly. And they jump into these extreme efforts, and they're like, this time I'm going to follow through. I'm going to be perfect. I'm going to do it all right now. And they're always trying to beat their best. And the way that I see it is, if we just try to beat our worst, that's a lot easier and more sustainable. So
Yes.
Let's just add some quality habits where, we're not going off the rails, where we're not, binging all the time because we're being so restrictive. If we just kind of raise the floor versus raising the ceiling, in my opinion, it's more sustainable, because failure is inevitable. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. We're going to fall down. There's going to be missteps. But if I fall down to a higher floor, well, it's much easier pick myself up and continue moving forward. So that's kind of the approach that we take with our clients.
I just had this giant epiphany right then while you were talking. It's like, our expertise here is exercise and specifically helping people exercise for their health. And if somebody's looking at, their exercise habits or whatnot, and they're thinking, well, the reason I'm not to my health goals yet is because I didn't hit my PR the last time I was in the gym. Like, that wouldn't make any sense. You'd say, well, maybe you're not to your health goals yet because you're not exercising as frequently as you should, or, you are, inconsistent with, how many days per week you're exercising or something like that. Right. So like you're saying, we would look at kind of addressing, hey, let's get the worst parts better, not let's fine tune the best parts and trying to push those as far as you can. And so I love that you are then applying that approach to nutrition as well. It makes total sense. How do you recommend that when people are trying to figure out, or where do I even start with my nutrition? Where's kind of like the starting place that you would recommend them looking, and like a step or two after that?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is awareness. And I'm a big believer in, if I could gift the world with one thing, it would be self-awareness. I think that if each individual, and again, it's not something that's very easy to develop. It does take a lot of hard conversations with yourself and some introspection and just, some soul searching. If you start to notice patterns in your life, there's probably a common denominator, and it's really helpful to try to unpack those. But, self-awareness is a great skill set to have and develop, and it can be developed. So what I do is let's start with awareness. What are we doing currently? Let's start with, what does an average day look like for you nutritionally? What have you tried in the past? I love to look back at diet history because, using the exercise example, if somebody's like, all right, let's do this, I'm going to come in 5 days a week. You're like, well, what's your confidence level in sticking with 5 days a week? And they're like, well, yeah. And well, this time I'm motivated. It's like, okay, great. But let's look back at your history. Have you ever tried to do 5 days a week before? And they're like, well, yeah. Well, how'd that work out for you? And they're like, well, I kind of fell off and then I stopped training for like 6 months, but now I'm back at it. I'm like, great. We're not going to start at 5 days a week because you have not shown, like, based off of, the science of hindsight, we know that would be setting you up for failure, and that would be irresponsible. Why don't we start with 2 days a week? And once that you prove that you can do 2 days a week, then we're going to add the third day, because again, we're beating our worst. The goal there is, we don't want the 6 months off from not training at all,
right,
that we created by trying to do too much. So if we beat our worst, if we start with the 2 days, we're going to, build some momentum and, prove to yourself that you can be consistent. And it's no different with nutrition. People want to come in, we want to look at their diet history, and they're like, hey, I'm ready to go. Like, let's do all of these things. I'm motivated. It's like, well, let's look back at what you've tried in the past and let's assess why those things didn't work. So the first thing is awareness. What are things at currently? What have you tried in the past? What do we know from, the science of hindsight, things that didn't work for you? And now we can come up with a starting point that you feel confident with. And really, for most people, it's super basic. We're just looking at quality. We're looking at the kinds of foods that you're eating. We're looking at some other habits. Even with nutrition, it's like, let's look at how much water you're drinking. Let's look at how much you're moving on a daily basis. Certain things that will kind of work synergistically. If somebody is only getting like 2,000 steps per day, and we can get them up to 3,000, 4,000 steps per day, that's going to make a huge move. Walking is one of the most underrated things that we can do. I truly believe that's like the one thing that is like the ace up your sleeve, is just walking more.
Sure.
But just something like that is going to move the needle more than me being like, all right, well, we're going to start with, this calorie cycling approach, and we're going to start hitting your macros perfectly. It's like, no, we're just going to start with 1 or 2 things that you feel really good about.
Yeah.
Whether that's from a quality standpoint, it could be from a quantity standpoint, or it could simply be like, let's just look at how you put your meals together. And we're going to make some suggestions there in terms of, are you getting veggies with each meal? Are you getting protein with each meal? What's the quality of those sources? Again, looking at water intake, looking at movement, or even stress. Sometimes we can't even talk about this until we address some of the stressors in your life that are really like the big roadblock. So again, this is, everybody wants the blanket answer, but it really does take an individual approach, because we have to start with where you're at, and nobody's going to have the same starting point. So It's looking at, creating that awareness first. So for everybody who's listening, it's like, well, where do I begin? Well, start assessing, like, what does an average day look like for you? What are your current nutrition habits? What have you tried in the past that you know was really ineffective? So like the diet where you lost 30 pounds, but then you gained back 40, that was probably too restrictive. That probably wasn't sustainable for you. So what can we learn from that? So start assessing, what are you currently doing? What have you tried in the past? And now let's look at, some of those nutritional principles or even health promoting habits that we can start. Do you feel confident walking more? Great. Like, let's do that. Do you feel confident adding more veggies or protein to your meals? Great. Let's do that. Like, what are the 2 things, 1 to 2 things that you feel really good about that we can start? I call them anchors when we talk to our clients. Like, those are the things that are going to serve you when life gets in the way, which we know it does. It's going to be messy. It's going to be stressful. Things happen. Those are the things that we want to hold on to as like the foundational pieces that will always move us forward.
I love that. I love it. It's incredible, isn't it? It's like as deep into the science of nutrition as you can get about, exactly how all the macronutrients are structured and, everything, how they all interact with each other and all the micronutrients, everything like that. It's like, it really just comes down, the large majority of it, to just some simple habits and some simple principles. It really doesn't have to be that complicated to start heading in the direction that you want to head. So I love that you break it down like that for people. Where can people find out more? Where can they connect with you? Do you work with people online?
Yeah, we do. Everything we do is virtual online coaching. So the best place to connect with me is probably Instagram. The handle is @coach_Mike_Millner. And I also have a podcast, which is called Mind Over Macros. So that's on all podcast platforms. Anybody can take a listen. And you're complete. You actually asked the question earlier about what's one of the biggest mistakes that people make. And I would say overcomplicating things, thinking that they need to start with the most advanced strategy. Most of the time, it's just the basics and coming back to the basics. And I told you I'm a psychology nerd. So I actually look at things in terms of like our hierarchy of needs, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And like the basics are at the bottom of the pyramid for a reason. Like you need those things first and foremost, like water and food and shelter. And those are the basic human needs. At the very top of the pyramid is like self-actualization. We shouldn't be starting there. Like we have to work our way up. And so nutrition is no different. It's just, it's just kind of a microcosm of life. And so let's start with the basics. Let's build our way up and earn the right to advance up to the more, more complex strategies.
I love it. That's brilliant. Well, Mike, we're going to put all the links to everything in the show notes. The question that we like wrapping up with for all of our guests is, what is your definition of health?
Yeah, I love it because that's something, again, you've probably noticed a theme here, which is my answer is typically it depends on the person. For me personally, I look at kind of 3 different pillars. And I think that some people will add a 4th. For me, it's like, frame, family, finance. Okay. So it's like my frame is my physical. So I want to take care of my health physically. Finance, I think that, being responsible with money, that sort of thing. And then, and also I have a business. So like my business health is also important. And then family, it's like relationships, not just my immediate family, but relationships in general. So I think that, everybody can have that their own definition. Some people would add spirituality. I think emotional and mental health are big components. So when I say like my frame, I'm talking about including my brain, including my mental health, including my emotional health. But some people like to keep those things as separate pillars. But that's the beauty of being an individual, is we get to decide what those things mean to us. And for some people, they might not care as much about the physical, or they might not care as much about the financial. And it just depends on what's important to you and what you value. I think that that's, again, something that can really create clarity in your life, is knowing what's truly important to you, and are the actions that you're taking closing that gap from where you are to where you want to be.
I love that. Mike, this was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your time, sharing your expertise with us. This was such a jam-packed, value-driven episode. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend it with us and enlighten us and our listeners, not only about what you do, but your brilliantly simple approach to nutrition that can be a super complex and super confusing topic. So thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So how cool is that? I mean, Julie, one thing that I loved about that episode is Mike broke it down so simply in terms of just super applicable things that we can do with our nutrition without being restrictive, without saying we need to upend everything that we're doing from an eating perspective and still improve how we're eating and still improve what we're eating by just being more mindful of the choices that we're making. So if you are interested in learning more about the work that Mike is doing, be sure to connect with him, follow his account, send him a message so you can dive deeper into his work. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find this episode when they're looking for information on exercise and when they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us that 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week. So what'd you think about that episode? Did you find the information useful? If you enjoyed what we discussed during today's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, then you are going to love what I'm going to be presenting during my new training, How to Rebuild Your Aching Body in as little as 6 weeks without changing your lifestyle. It's happening this week, and you can get registered for free by going to secrets.exerciseforlifemethod.com. But space is limited, so you need to head there now. secrets.exerciseforlifemethod.com, and I can't wait to see you there. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.